Thank you so much, Andrew. It's a great pleasure, great honor to be here and to talk about one of the articles in your 2018 edition. It's entitled Deglobalization, the Rise of Disembedded Unilateralism. And all of those words look rather complicated, so I wanted to try to unpack those words in the course of the morning. What's behind it, and we were told that these should be articles, review articles, and I tried to embrace a really comprehensive literature on deglobalization, but they should be articles with, we were told, an attitude. And the attitude is more and more visible all over the world. So at the recent annual meetings of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the president of Indonesia, Joko Widodo, started off with a slogan, "Winter is coming." Winter is coming. I hadn't really been aware of the reference, the range of reference that the president was making with that until a couple of years ago. It's a reference, and he went on to elaborate it, it's a reference to this very popular pseudo-Shakespearean, pseudo-historical, a little bit magical, a little bit science fiction TV series called The Game of Thrones, where big powers are fighting for dominance. It's a ruthless, really ruthless world of competition and destruction, and it's a frightening tableau to mount there for the annual meeting of the International Monetary Fund. I had really only started to be aware that Game of Thrones, my students in Princeton, they all watch Game of Thrones, but I'd only been aware of it when I read the really excellent blow-by-blow micro-history account of the origins of Brexit by the Sunday Times journalist Tim Shipman. And Shipman describes one of the protagonists, one of the key protagonists, Michael Gove, as being a passionate, fanatic follower of Game of Thrones, to the extent that he plays, apparently, board games with his friends on Game of Thrones. And so I thought I'd better look at this, and so I spent a couple of transatlantic flights viewing this series. And what it is really a version of extreme, what's called realism in political science, where there are no permanent alliances you're out to do in the other side. It's a zero-sum game, and the world of Game of Thrones is describing a zero-sum world that some people thought had come after the financial crisis. And there's a nice book by Gideon Rachman on exactly that subject of the zero-sum world. But the zero-sum world is also implicitly a world of deglobalization. So I thought of that quite a long time ago, in the early 2000s, when I wrote a book called The End of Globalization, and it was difficult to explain what exactly that was. It was fundamentally a historical look at the way in which globalization, as it had really emerged in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, fell apart in the interwar era, and the book ended with a kind of question mark: can this kind of deglobalization be repeated? And what the book tried to do, and then I tried to follow the structure of this a bit in the article for the annual reviews, The book looked at different aspects of globalization, financial flows, of course, so it's appropriate to have this discussion here, but also trade flows and migration flows, and tried to show how they're interdependent, how in some instances, for instance, if migration stops flowing, there's a build-up of population, and then there's a search for products that can be made and marketed and sold somewhere else. And so trade openness is essential if you don't have the open borders for migration. But then there are restrictions, mounting pressures for restriction on that, and also financial flows collapse. That's the story of the interwar era. And at that time, I ended with a kind of question mark on whether that can be repeated. Now we know that it can be repeated. So this is the from the book by Bob Woodward on the current president, and this is one of his speaking notes, so a handwritten speaking note, telling you that trade is bad. And there's obviously behind this a real theory of attacking both globalization and the movement that he calls globalism and the people who represent it, who he calls globalists. So a couple of weeks ago in Texas, you know what a globalist is. A globalist is a person that wants the globe to do well, frankly not caring about our country so much, and you know what, we can't have that. So that's not a uncommon kind of sentiment. So there's a pushback against globalization and globalists. You know, a much more moderate version of the same thing was given in the first policy speech by the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, in the Mansion House at the end of 2016. The forces of liberalism and globalization which have held sway in Britain, America, and across the Western world for years have left too many people behind. When you refuse to accept that globalization in its current form has left too many people behind, you are not sowing the seeds for its growth, but for its ruin. So there's a kind of story of deglobalization there. And it's a distinct kickback against a world that was constructed basically by, at least I think very prominently, by the two powers that are in some ways at the moment seeming to be at the front of the political movement against globalism, the United States and the United Kingdom, in the Bretton Woods conference in New Hampshire in the summer of 1944, so just at a decisive stage, just after the Normandy landings. The story there is that looking back on the collapse of globalization in the interwar period, the makers of Bretton Woods started with the perception that both prosperity and peace were inseparable, that you couldn't have them in just one country alone. And so that was the theme of the opening address by Henry Morgenthau, and it came back at the end of the Bretton Woods conference. Peace and prosperity are indivisible. I think that's widely known, but I think it's important to go a little bit further than that and to think about the ways in which that interconnection was going to be realized. And the way that it was realized was by a whole web of agreements. And some of those were agreements by treaties to create multilateral institutions. Some of those were the acts of powerful countries to get trade law, for instance. Some of it was the acts of government-instituted regulatory authorities operating internationally, like IOSCO. Some of it was the act of entirely private regulations and regulators, iOS. So it's a kind of world in which regulation was embedded in an international network. Domestic regulation was embedded in multilateral regulation and international and supranational regulation. And the Columbia political scientist, John Ruggie, has a term for that, which he calls embedded liberalism. And it's embedded liberalism which gave me the kind of idea of what's happening when embedded liberalism gets disembedded and into unilateralism. And if you like to be cynical about the Bretton Woods Agreement, one way of thinking of it, at least, was to think that it was a way of preserving the institutions and the regulatory framework that the New Deal created in response to the Great Depression by internationalizing it, by putting it in an international framework. So that's exactly what that sense of embedded liberalism means. And the story then is pushing back against that. So how much of that has actually taken place? I mean, that's obviously a question, and there's a lot of research on that. I tried to present quite a lot. So on the face of it, you can think that there may be some signs of deglobalization in all of the areas that we've looked at, thought about in trade, in capital flows, in migration flows. So with capital flows, looking at the BIS's compilation of cross-border claims, it really does look as if 2008 was indeed a turning point, and there's a big fall after that. You have to be a little bit careful with this, I think, because a lot of this is a reflection of just what's going on in Europe. And there clearly is in Europe a renationalization of finance after the GFC, the Great Recession, and it's pushed by national regulators, but it isn't a global one. And so if you take the European data out of this, you don't see the same kind of effect. There's also a much, much more substantial rise in foreign investment in this period. So the story of financial flows collapsing clearly isn't completely right, but we're in a world that at least thinks about the possibility of deglobalization and renationalization. And indeed, I think that is actually going to continue as a kind of issue. And as part of the reaction to Brexit, the European Securities and Markets Authority in Paris is putting greater claims to regulate in the European sphere. And that's pushing then a response in the United States, where that's seen as an illegitimate interference in the doctrine of equivalence. So we're not at the end of the story of financial deregulation because of the reorientation of a regulatory framework. The trade area, I think, is the area that most people think of when they think about globalization and deglobalization. And there's a long and quite convincing story after the Second World War for a long, long period of time that world trade is always growing quicker than industrial production, output, GDP. And that changes in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. World trade starts to grow less rapidly than GDP from 2013, 2014. But again, you might say, well, it's not quite as simple as it looks. There's a pushback on that one because, for instance, there may be quite other explanations for it. In particular, there's a technical explanation for it, or a technological explanation for it. That is that supply chains can be shortened because of new technologies of production. You can produce nearer to the market. That's often beneficial because you want to react quickly, in some areas at least, to changes of fashion, changes of demand. And so it's important then to locate your production and not to have the long-distance transportation. And that movement of onshoring is an important part of the story. And so it's onshoring that may drive some of the trade story without it being driven by protective measures. There's a nice survey that the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland, Simon Everett, has been doing since the financial crisis, of looking at global trade measures, global trade alert. And so they provide a count of the number of measures that are restrictive or discriminatory, and a count of the number of measures that are liberalizing. And basically, the story this is updated to today. In the article, because of the way that articles go and it goes to press, it stopped in 2017. And 2017 was really quite interesting, and it is a kind of exception to this story. So you might think that 2016, there's the election of in the United States with all the principal campaigners, even Senator Clinton, pushed back on some trade agreements. And you might think that this is going to prompt a wave of discriminatory trade legislation. In 2017, there was more liberalizing trade legislation than there was discriminatory trade regulation. But 2018, we really look as if we're back in a world of trade wars. And that's the immediate background, clearly. And the big US-China conflict is the immediate background of the invocation of the Game of Thrones. Is that going to be a repetition of the world of the 1930s? Are we really going to go into a trade war environment? And people, commentators, politicians, markets as well, have been just very uncertain about that. It's difficult to believe that something as terrible as this is really going to happen. And so many people have the kind of reassuring belief that it won't happen or it can't happen, that there will be a pullback. And so there's always a search for a little bit of optimism. So if you think of what happened on Tuesday, the commentators wanted to look in particular at the behavior, the political behavior of people who were really going to be badly, immediately affected by trade wars. And so they looked at soybean producers or pig producers. And the story there is actually, it's not completely clear again where we're headed. The Republican vote in many of those areas, in soybean producing areas, say the 13th congressional district in Illinois, fell. And the Democratic vote rose, but it wasn't enough in that 13th district, which is quite typical for a soybean-producing area. It wasn't enough to produce a Democratic victory in that case. So there is a sense, I think, and I look at some of the evidence for this in the article, that trade measures are really difficult to take for many people because they immediately cut into welfare. So they make iPhones or T-shirts or a whole range of consumer items, obviously more expensive. Washing machines already increased in price. So they have an effect on consumer welfare. And it may be as a result of that actually it really is quite difficult to embark on a real trade war rather than on the threat of a trade war. The area Where I think the pushback is most likely to be pronounced is in terms of the discussion of the third area of globalization and migration. You see, if you look at migration flows, people born outside the country in all the big industrial countries in the European Union and high-income countries in the United States, you see an increase, very, very much like the world before the First World War, with also a substantial rise in the foreign-born population that produces a backlash. And if you like to go back in time, this is not a new phenomenon that took place in the early 20th century, a backlash against migration, a backlash taking place today. You can see it in earlier moments of kind of proto-globalization in the 16th century. One recently discovered manuscript in the handwriting of William Shakespeare, a play about the British English figure on the eve of the Reformation, Thomas More. More's speech in Shakespeare's handwriting is a denunciation of a crowd in London that is trying to attack migrants and push the migrants from the Baltic back to where they came from. And Shakespeare's presentation of More goes against that. So this is really where the movement is taking place, the movement against flows of migration. But I think it's important to go back, and the final section of the paper does that, go back to the theme of a rejection of the principle of embedded liberalism. And the figure who's articulated this most clearly and is currently working in Europe to try to coordinate anti-EU parties is, you recognize him on the board, Steve Bannon, who predicts that Macron and Merkel will fall down like bowling pins. And what it really is, I think, is a response to the financial crisis, a sense that emergency measures are needed, that the regulation is too complicated, that it needs to be swept away, but also that the party structure is wrong and needs to be remolded. And that, I think, is part of the real business of both the creation of what happens in a globalized world and the pushback against it. It's a political process. In the world of globalization, as it was successful in the late 20th century, almost every industrial country had just two political parties, two major political parties. One was the center-right party, one was the center-left party. They competed against each other. The center-right party couldn't be as hostile to redistribution as it wanted because it needed to appeal to the median voter. The center-left party couldn't redistribute as much as it would, maybe some of its followers would like to, because it also needed to appeal to the median voter. But distribution and redistribution took place in a national context. With globalization, that starts to break down. So this is something that's already happening before the financial crisis, but the financial crisis intensifies this development. And there you get parties on the wings that think we can do more for our citizens, we can distribute more if we don't have the international transfers. And so we want to make finance national and goods national and the labor market national. So that really is pushing a meltdown of political parties. The anticipation of this, the pioneer on this path was Italy in the 1990s, but now it's happening in every big industrial country. The old political parties, you're seeing it in countries even that are not really touched by any kind of direct economic problem. In Germany, the SPD and the CDU are really falling apart. Brexit produces an intolerable position both for the Conservative Party and for the Labour Party. They can't deal with it. So in that world, this call to disembed your regulatory framework and regulate nationally so that you're not affected by cross-border spillovers becomes more and more powerful. Before I conclude, I wanted to leave you with two slides. One is a kind of warning. This is a long story of returns on safe assets from a recent paper by Jordan and Schulerick and Taylor and others. And the interesting thing about it, I think you can see, is that in the aftermath of big financial crises, 1907, 1929, but also 2007, 2008, the rate of return on safe assets declines. But you can also see, if you look at the preceding ones, that they're anticipations of great power conflict. So it goes before the First World War, this is the pattern, before the Second World War, and that's the world that Henry Morgenthau was looking at. Is it absolutely hopeless? The one hope is, I think, there's a kind of iconic figure from one of the great European writers, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe in Goethe's Faust. He has a diabolical figure, Mephisto, who is permanently trying to do the negative things, but then he explains, I'm part of the power which eternally wills evil and eternally works good. In other words, the extent of the challenge to globalization can produce a reforming and a rediscussion. And so if you think of something like the reform of the WTO, it may well indeed be pushed by the degree of the possibility of a trade war. And so a good effect might come out of the risk of deglobalization. That's why I think it's important to discuss deglobalization and why deglobalization is such an issue 10 years after the financial crisis. Thank you.